Greetings and welcome to another episode of Two Ball Guys. My name is Dave Anderson, a senior policy fellow at the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, otherwise known as WIPS. Today, we're excited to present the third in our series of programs on election reform in America. And our topic for today is election reform, what are the trade-offs? Featuring a nationally known return guest from UW-Madison, who we will be introducing shortly.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And my name is Eric Giordano, and I'm the Executive Director of WIPS. WIPS is a unit of the University of Wisconsin system, founded in 2007 with a mission to educate and engage Wisconsin residents, develop future leaders, and help communities address identified needs. And speaking of addressing identified needs, Dave, I am really excited to let you know that following today's show, I am scheduled to receive my first COVID vaccine. And in celebration of that, I was thinking about sharing a coronavirus joke. But, you know, there have been so many coronavirus jokes out there already. It's been a real pandemic, right? Get it? Pandemic?
I got it, Eric.
All right. And while I would definitely like to tell you a coronavirus joke now, given your questionable capacity for humor, I think we'll have to wait 2 weeks to see if you got it. Get it?
Very, very good. Very good, Eric. You know, our viewers might think that this banter that we do and really the entire show is spontaneous and we do this off the cuff. But little do they know that Eric is the mastermind behind the scripting for our weekly shows. And I have to say, Eric, I was a little nervous today because we were like 30 minutes out from showtime and I hadn't received today's script. So I quickly emailed you and I said, oh my gosh, Eric, do we have a script for today? And I want to let our viewers know that not only does Eric use witty puns during the show, but he also uses witty puns just in his day-to-day life and day-to-day routine. His email response to me was, sorry to be cutting it close, Dave. And then he wrote on his email, get it? Cutting it close. So I just wanted to share that with our viewers to let them know really what a great mastermind you are behind our show. So thank you for all of that.
Yeah, you just want to let them know that my sophomoric humor continues even after the show. Right, I get it.
But now it is time to acknowledge and thank our hardworking producer, marketing specialist, chill hop DJ, and token representative of that attractive younger generation, Luke Rudolph. Greetings, Luke, and thanks for everything you do to help make the show the success that it is.
Yep, thank you, Luke, or disembodied Luke. So, to our great audience members, our 3 or 4 audience members that we can confirm, if you have a joke or pun to share or a comment about the show, you can write them in the Facebook chat, or if you're watching the show later, you can email us at info@wips.org. That's info@wipps.org. And you know, Dave, we actually do get people who email in about the show. Like I got an email this week about one of our previous guests, and they wanted more information, and we were able to put them in contact with the organization that the guest represented. So we definitely will respond to you, especially since there's only 1 or 2 of you. But speaking of the Facebook chat section today, I wanted to make sure our viewers know that today our show is not airing live, so we will not be taking live audience questions. We had to tape this on Wednesday to accommodate our guests, and we're very grateful could take the time to do that. So this is actually a rebroadcast.
And thanks, Eric. That actually leads right into the introduction of our special guest for this week, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome him to the show entitled Electoral Reform, What are the Trade-offs? Featuring Barry Burden, Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the director of the Elections Research Center and is the Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics. Dr. Burden is the author of numerous books and peer-reviewed articles on issues of elections and voting, and is a frequent guest on national news programs on these topics. So welcome once again to our show, Dr. Burden. We're glad to have you here.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, it looks so sunny there in Madison.
This might not be a live shot behind me, just
Okay.
in full transparency.
Well, in keeping with the theme of our show today, right? We're not live. Okay, so we're so grateful to have you. And for those who aren't aware, Dr. Burden is making his second appearance on the show, and that's very special. We really appreciate it. Especially special because usually we don't invite people with full heads of hair on for a repeat visit. So, but we're very grateful that you're here. So let's jump right in. So we've been focusing on election reform for the last couple of weeks on our show, and particularly the reform in the presidential election. And we've had a couple of guests on who have been proposing some ideas for reform. And we'd love to start out by getting your reaction to a couple of those ideas that we've heard about. So the first idea was something called Final Five voting that's being promoted by Democracy Found and a couple of other organizations. In fact, there's some national organizations who call this ranked choice voting. And the idea, which actually exists in some other countries and has been practiced in a few states, even in the United States, is that voters will actually rank their top candidates when they vote. And in races where a candidate receives more than half of the first choice votes, that candidate will win, just like in any other election. However, if there's no majority winner after counting those first choices, then the race is decided by an instant runoff, and or the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who pick that candidate as their first choice will then have their votes counted for their second choice. And then this process kind of continues until there's a candidate receives more than 50% of the vote. Now there's some different variations on this. So we'd love to hear about your thoughts about this type of voting system. And is this something that, what are some of the trade-offs of this type of system?
Well, it's a really intriguing idea. It's an out-of-the-box kind of proposal in one sense. It is a form of ranked choice voting. And that's one of the hot reforms that's sort of moving across the country. It's been used in some localities, especially some bigger cities like Minneapolis, Portland, and San Francisco for a number of years. But now it's actually gotten traction at the statewide level. As you were saying, the state of Maine uses it for presidential elections, gubernatorial elections. Alaska has just adopted it for its statewide elections. So we're going to get to learn what it looks like at the statewide level after having seen it operate at the municipal level in some other places. I think there are real trade-offs. And so I appreciate that being one of the themes tying together the conversation here. The real benefits that advocates of Final Five or of ranked choice voting offer are that it could lead to better politics, essentially more consensual, cooperative politics rather than hostile, combative politics. The system today is that the candidate who gets the most votes in your state or district wins the seat and everyone else gets nothing. And so there's a real incentive for candidates to try to gin up enthusiasm among their supporters. And they often do that by belittling their opponents or suggesting a kind of threat or enemy on the other side. And that's not the sort of politics most of us would like. But there's an argument, and I think some evidence, that ranked choice voting would produce more cooperative campaigns, because not only do you need to get your supporters out as a candidate, but you would like supporters of some of your opponents, if they're not going to rank you first, to at least rank you second or third. And so belittling them or criticizing the candidate they support is likely to cost you in the second or third rounds of that runoff process. One bit of evidence for this: in a recent mayoral election in San Francisco, where ranked choice voting is used, there were lots of candidates on the ballot. The two leading candidates, actually near the end of the campaign, decided to endorse each other. They were the two leading people, who were viable in the race, and decided that they would ask their supporters to each rank the other person second, in the hopes that one of them would get in and they could keep out some of the fringe candidates. So, if that sort of experience carries over, then this could be a way to keep some more extreme elements out of politics and work towards a more consensual, cooperative kind of politics. I think it would also help other parties to get into the mix. Minor parties or independent candidates who right now have a difficult time getting on the ballot and getting attention and being taken seriously. There are some real trade-offs. One is you've got to school voters in how to use this system. You have to train voters to go from picking one person to ranking candidates. Hopefully they're going to rank more than one or two of them. We'd like a complete ranking, because that lets the system work through as each wave of low-ranked candidates is removed. If everyone does not rank all of the options available, you can end up with the final candidate actually getting a small number of votes. Even though they get a majority, the ballots of many people will be exhausted. For example, if there were 5 candidates and I only, as a voter, decided only to rank 2 of them, and those 2 get eliminated along the way, I'm not really a player in the final decision as to who's going to be elected from that state or district. So encouraging voters to become educated about a wider range of candidates and to fully rank is really helpful to making the system healthy. And then, of course, the voting systems themselves have to be modified. The ballot has to be redesigned. And I think we're learning about good and bad ways to do that from the experiences around the country, but it can lead to some confusion. I think the most common method we've seen are ballots that have columns, either for each of the rank choices or for each of the candidates. And a voter will have to go through picking their number 1, their number 2, their number 3, number 4. But that ballot can be invalidated if a voter makes a mistake, for example, accidentally picking 2 candidates for the second slot, or picking a candidate as both their first choice and their third choice, whether that's intentional or by accident. That can cause the ballot to be tossed. So I think there's just some education and readjustment of our expectations that have to come with this.
Yeah, thank you. And I could definitely see how that could definitely complicate things. Like you said, I mean, if we're already having issues of, ballots being accepted or rejected because they've been filled out inappropriately, there's certainly more room for error. I wonder, are there some other downsides? Like who do you think might oppose something like this? I mean, my obvious observation would be the parties would perhaps oppose this, the 2 main parties, but I don't know, maybe that's not true.
Yeah, I think the 2 major parties have some risk in making this change. The way it would be implemented in Wisconsin, this Final 5 concept would do away with party primaries. There would be one big primary where all of the candidates seeking that office are in the mix together. And so that removes some of the power of parties to choose their own nominees. Now, I think our major parties are pretty good at adapting. They figure out the campaign finance system or the voting system or whatever it is, and are quite resilient at keeping control even when things appear to undermine them. So I think the parties would find a way to coordinate and to pick their strongest candidates to encourage them to run in the primary. There was a similar argument made in Wisconsin 100 years ago when the direct primary was implemented as an alternative to backroom conventions and caucuses as ways to choose nominees. People said this is going to undermine political parties, and without the ability to nominate their own candidates in a back room or at a caucus hall, they may not exist. But parties learned to navigate that process in Wisconsin, and we would not say the parties are weak or uninfluential in our state. But it would take an adjustment on the part of parties. I think it would invite some candidates who are not in one of the major parties to run. I view that as a good thing. I think this is a big, complicated country, and we deserve more than 2 parties. Most other democracies around the world have more than 2 viable parties. So it's possible that the big parties would oppose. In some places, I think if there's one major party that's really dominant in a state or in a district, they might oppose this for fear that it would upset their dominance. So if you're in a very red or blue district or state, you could see the hegemonic party there really fighting it. That's not the Wisconsin case. We are a purple state, lots of competition. So I don't think there's going to be one party opposing it, but both parties will probably have some reservations, and I think that's okay. It's designed in part to shake up the system. So if it shakes up the major parties a bit, I view that as a feature, not a bug.
So before we go on to the next model, Dave, did you have any follow-up questions about this particular model, the ranked choice model?
I'm reminded a little bit about Abraham Lincoln when he was nominated to be the Republicans' first candidate for president. And he told his supporters, look, I'm not so concerned about who places first on the, who leads the ballot on the first ballot. If that person doesn't get a majority, I'm more concerned about who ranks second, and which of course he did. And then he went on ultimately to get that nomination. And I kind of equate this ranked choice, with that reflection of Abraham Lincoln. But it is an interesting model, and I think it could generate a heck of a lot of discussion. So, but I don't have any further questions on it.
Okay. I'd like to turn to another model. Last week we had on as our guest Representative Gary Tauken from Bonduelle, who's a Republican in Wisconsin, and he's introducing or trying to introduce a bill for a model that some people call the district model, and that's a model where each district, organized already within each state, like in Wisconsin we have 8, right, would select its elector. So we're talking about the presidential election now. So it would select its elector based on the plurality of that district. In other words, which presidential candidate had won that district in terms of having more votes than the other. So in the end, rather than a winner-take-all approach for all of the state's electoral votes, this would allow states to split electoral votes based on the winner of a particular district. So in Wisconsin, this would allow 8 of our electoral votes to be decided by each district's popular vote. And then 2 of our electoral votes would be based on the overall statewide vote. And I know you know this, but I'm explaining this for our viewers. Maine and Nebraska already use this approach. Comment on this. What are the trade-offs of this approach? Do you think there's, it's the good outweighs the bad, or vice versa, or it's a wash?
Well, I really appreciate the motivation for the proposal. I'm dissatisfied the way I think a lot of Americans are dissatisfied with the Electoral College. After all, it's an antique that was created in the 1700s, before there were political parties, when there were only 13 states, when most Americans didn't have the right to vote. And to think that it has survived mostly intact these 220 some years is really amazing. And I think it's outlived its initial usefulness. So I like states experimenting. States have the right to allocate their electors as they wish. That's built into the Constitution. So I appreciate Representative Tauken's sincerity in looking for alternatives. But I do have reservations about this approach. And I think they're along 2 tracks. One is that the districts in Wisconsin, at least, are not configured in a way to be balanced between the 2 parties or to fairly represent the underlying vote in the state. That's both because of where Democrats and Republicans in the state happen to live. It makes it hard to make districts that are fair, but also because one party got to draw the districts last time and they naturally drew them in a way to advantage their side. And so even in an election where the vote is narrowly divided between the 2 presidential candidates, Republicans are going to continue to get an advantage. So just take our last 2 presidential elections, both of which were very close. Trump narrowly won in 2016, Trump narrowly lost in 2020. So they're both essentially 50-50 elections. You might expect in a state with 10 electoral votes, each side would get about 5 or 4 to 6, something like that. But in 2016, it would have been 8 electoral votes for Trump and only 2 for Biden, 8-2, despite it being basically 50-50 tie. And even in 2020, if my math is right here, it's still a tie vote, but Trump would have gotten more electoral votes. He would have gotten 6 because there's 6 congressional districts that went for Trump. Biden would have gotten the 2 Democratic ones plus the 2 statewide. So you still get a distorted outcome where the electoral votes don't really reflect the votes in the state. But I do understand Representative Tauken's concern about this winner-take-all system. It really does create a bizarre market for the candidates who spend all of their time, it seems, all of their money, all of their effort in 5 or 6 states and really neglect the rest of the country. That's not a one-person, one-vote model. It's not an inclusive system that really makes the country part of a common election. But I think there's some other alternatives out there I would pick above a district-based system for allocating the electors.
Just to follow up on that, and we asked Representative Tauken about this too. I mean, Wisconsin really has been a battleground state and has gotten a fair amount of attention in the last several presidential elections. Do you think this type of a system would diminish the state as a battleground state, or do you think it could enhance it because it becomes even more competitive at the congressional district level?
No, it would diminish the interest of the national campaigns in Wisconsin. They don't come here because they like us or they think the Wisconsin voter is really important to represent in the election. It's because it's a swing state, and winning by 1 vote is enough to get all of the state's electors. And let me just highlight another concern about this proposal. There's already a lot of partisanship built into the drawing of districts. It's one of the most partisan things the legislature does. And just about 3 years ago, the Supreme Court heard a case from Wisconsin and two others about redistricting, and their decision, this is the Gill v. Whitford case out of Wisconsin, their decision in that spate of cases was that the federal courts have no role to play in hemming in partisanship in the drawing of district lines. So any guardrails that were in place in terms of one party trying to harm the other party, the Supreme Court says those are gone. So I would expect this next round of district drawing to be even more partisan around the country than it was 10 years ago. But it's going to be enhanced if those districts not only elect members of Congress, but now they're also choosing electors to the Electoral College. The House is narrowly divided. Democrats only have a 3 or 4 seat majority there. So every district around the country suddenly becomes hugely important. And the Electoral College will just be part of that. So I worry that a district-based plan is actually going to exacerbate a problem that most of us are already pretty unhappy with.
So we've talked about a couple of specific reforms in the opening of the show that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks. But man, there are election reform proposals being introduced all over the country, and even in the Congress of the United States. And there's really a variety of reforms that are being proposed. As you kind of scan the national landscape, what are some of the other initiatives that seem to be gaining momentum as states and the federal government are looking at electoral reform measures?
Well, the things that are gaining momentum are working in different directions, depending on where you are. At the federal level, the Democrats in the Congress are pushing a bill called H.R. 1 that would adopt a whole range of measures. It's really quite a menu of ideas that have been bubbling up on the Democratic side of the aisle over the last 2 or 3 years. So pre-pandemic ideas. It would include things like requiring every state to have same-day voter registration, the way Wisconsin does, automatic voter registration, a certain amount of early voting, limits on how strict a voter ID requirement can be. It would also include campaign finance reform with some public funding and some matching funds, some ethics reform. It would require presidential candidates to submit their tax returns for public scrutiny. So it's a long laundry list that I think sets a set of minimum standards that all states would have to adopt. And so some states that are lagging below those standards would have to make some real changes to catch up. But I think other states like Wisconsin are probably closer to that threshold already. And so it would be less impactful here. But what's going on in the states now is very different, especially in the swing states, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. In those states, we're seeing hundreds of bills, some of them from Democrats who want to, I think, build on the successes of the 2020 election and enhance voter access and really continue the success of voting by mail that was used so much last year. On the other side, we're seeing hundreds of bills from Republicans who would like to squelch a lot of that and put more controls in place around, mostly around absentee voting, and also to some degree around voter registration. So in places like Florida and Iowa, there are now battling bills over things like whether drop boxes for absentee ballots should be allowed at all. In Florida, there's a proposal to do away with them entirely, or whether each county or municipality should only be allowed to have one. That's the proposal that's been adopted in Iowa. There's a similar proposal in Wisconsin that would only allow one drop box for each municipality, no matter how big the city or how small the village, it would have one box. So there's a tremendous amount of activity, probably more legislating around election reforms and kind of the nuts and bolts of election administration than I have ever seen, but it's working at real cross purposes. There's not a lot of consensus. You've got to look pretty hard to find places where the parties are coming together with some, some agreement about what to do.
Eric, I'm gonna jump in here with a follow-up question, and you've kind of touched on this already. But what do you think is driving all of these electoral reform proposals? And in your opinion, is it really an effort to restore confidence in our elections? There's been a lot of concern about that, obviously. Or do you think there's more politically driven reasons that really have been supporting the push to do this wide variety of things, depending upon the state and whoever's introducing it?
Yeah, I don't think it's about voter confidence. If legislators or other party leaders were concerned about voter confidence, they could just tell voters, we are confident that the election in 2020 was run fairly. It was secure. There's no perfect election. This is a big country. It's hard to serve 300 million people and manage 150 million voters, poll workers, ballots, all of that. But it was quite well run, highly transparent, just very successful, highest levels of voter turnout in a century. So that's a message that could go out. And at the same time, there could still be tweaks to election practices and election laws. It doesn't mean you have to accept everything about how the election was run to admit that it was run pretty well and that we ought to really have confidence in those results. So I think rhetorically, there's a lot that leaders of parties could do now to simply tell their voters it was a pretty darn good election. And at the same time, we're going to do a review of what worked and what didn't work and make some changes. I don't think confidence is likely to be boosted much, especially when the reforms that are coming along are going to be advocated mostly by one party. And if they're passed, they're going to be passed over the resistance of the opposition party. Confidence might be boosted if there was a genuine bipartisan effort with hearings and testimony and listening to voters and thoughtfully producing some legislation to try to rectify some of the imperfections of the last election. But I don't see that happening in many state capitals at the moment.
Thank you. Dr. Burden, you've already sort of cast a little bit of your own doubt on, the value of the Electoral College system that's been around for so long that may be, outdated. So I want to talk a little bit about that system, and but some people say that it really isn't that so much that's the issue, that the real issues are more upstream. They're problems like the fact that we have a two-party system, the fact that we allow for that kind of gerrymandering that you talked about. Maybe it's money in politics or any other issues that some people feel have corrupted, quote unquote, the electoral system. So I'm just kind of curious from your standpoint, what would you say are the one or two most urgent fixes that we should consider to restore confidence in our elections, to make them fair, to make them freer, so people feel like, they actually are enfranchised and have power to, determine their future by who they elect. What should we do?
Well, I do think the Electoral College ought to be on that list. It's the most visible, the most prominent election structure in the country. And it's really obvious to voters when the popular vote and the Electoral College vote don't match, that something is amiss. It just doesn't feel right intuitively. And I think voters also understand that it's not a one person, one vote system. In a voter in Wyoming, where there are only about 500,000 or 600,000 people, it gets 3 electors going to Washington to represent them. But there are places like Dane County, where I live, that has as many people as Wyoming, but we certainly don't have 3 electors. So the combination of the higher and lower weighting of voters, depending on where you happen to live, and then this crazy winner-take-all system that's used by all states but 2, just creates some real distortions, and as I mentioned before, skews campaigns to focus on a small number of places. So I would keep that on the list of things that need to be addressed. But I think right after that would be the drawing of districts, what I call the gerrymandering problem. It is named after Elbridge Gerry. This too, I think on its face, just doesn't feel right to most voters, that a party can win 55 or 60% of the vote in a state and not get a majority of the seats. And in some cases in Wisconsin, the majority party has gotten, well over 50% of the vote and only gotten about 40% of the seats. So it's a clear mismatch between what the voters have expressed on the ballot in terms of which party they'd like to see in control, and the actual distribution of seats in the legislature that will then make policy. And it becomes this kind of self-reinforcing process, because if the party that drew the districts advantages itself, it's then locked in for 10 years. It's unlikely to lose its majority and has the ability to draw the districts again the next 10 years. So it becomes very hard to get out of that cycle. I will say on redistricting, there's much more reform effort going on than with the Electoral College. 2 years ago in the midterm elections, there were several states that adopted redistricting reform. Michigan was one of them, where they've adopted a nonpartisan citizens commission to draw the districts. So taking the power totally out of the hands of the state legislature, or at least having the legislature delegate that power to a commission that has representatives of both parties or people who are of no political party. to draw those maps and let the legislators get to the business of legislating. It shouldn't be writing their own job descriptions by drawing district lines for themselves. They ought to be working on the people's business and let some nonpartisan observers do this. These commissions have really taken off. They've been in places like Arizona and California for a number of years, but now we've got, I think it was 4 or 5 more states that have come online in the last couple of years. So this, I think it's a really exciting reform. It's not perfect, but my gosh, what we've been doing to this point in state legislatures is very far from perfect. The trouble in Wisconsin is it's not possible for voters to put this issue on the ballot. The state constitution just doesn't allow that kind of activity. So whereas our friends in Michigan could adopt it by collecting signatures, getting it on the ballot, and then passing it, in Wisconsin, it's going to have to come probably from the state legislature itself. And that's a tall order because they really enjoy having the power to draw the districts directly.
So I have to ask, you were with us last, I think, just after the November 2020 election. And we were talking about the fact that there seemed to be some dissatisfaction politically with the outcome. And at that time, you expressed, your strong view that that President Biden would in fact be inaugurated, which in fact he was, and it would be kind of an orderly process. Were you surprised at how things ultimately played out, though, with the number of legal challenges and the number of political challenges and some of the unrest that we ended up seeing in early January? Did any of that surprise you, or did you kind of see that coming?
Well, I was prepared for there to be resistance to the outcome. I was prepared, I think the way a lot of us were, that Donald Trump would be reluctant to accept the result. He might be reluctant to leave office, even if others in his party had accepted the result. But there were other elements that were genuinely surprising. Most surprising was the insurrection at the Capitol. Just an unbelievable event. It's still shocking to see video from that day and to imagine that happened in our country on the day that the electoral votes were being certified. That's just an astounding event that we can't let happen again. But even the path from election day to there had some bumps along the way that I didn't anticipate. I didn't imagine there would be so many lawsuits filed in so many states by so many parties asking for the results to be tossed or overturned, or some ballots to be removed. I think in Wisconsin alone, there were 7 or 8 lawsuits filed in federal or state court trying to undo the election results. Some of those came from Trump or the Trump campaign, but others came from independent groups who were not, sometimes state legislators, sometimes independent plaintiffs. And so there's just a tremendous amount of litigating going on. Now, all of those suits were tossed out, so they weren't successful, but they really clogged up the courts and I think contributed to lower confidence, mainly among Trump supporters, about what had happened. I was also really shocked that there were officials in several of the swing states, including Wisconsin, who so distrusted the result that they didn't believe that the Democratic electors should have gathered in the state capitals back on December 14th when that happened. And they had rogue meetings of separate unofficial electors who sat together and signed certificates as if they were chosen. This actually happened in Wisconsin. There were 10 Democratic electors who met in the Capitol on December 14th. That's required by the Constitution and federal law. But there were also 10 Republicans who met outside the Capitol who had this sort of pretend ceremony and tried to send those certificates to Washington as well. That was just an unbelievable kind of almost a shadow government forming that you will see in struggling democracies, but you don't tend to see in a really mature democracy like ours. I was also surprised to see a number of elected officials who did not accept the results of the election, even verbally. 4 years ago, when Donald Trump was elected, I think Democrats accepted that victory. They were not happy about it, of course, but they accepted it. That night of the election, I believe Hillary Clinton called Donald Trump and congratulated him. That's standard process. I think it was the next day that President Obama met with Donald Trump. That's also fairly standard. It was shortly thereafter that the transition process in the federal government began. None of that happened in 2020. There was no congratulations. There was no meeting with the incumbent president. The transition was very slow to happen. despite the fact that we were in the midst of an economic and public health crisis. So those are really worrying signs that I think they're things that have to be addressed and prevented to ensure the peaceful transition and the orderly functioning of government after future presidential elections.
And that kind of leads into a follow-up. I mean, what do you think are the long-term ramifications of what we experienced as a result of this particular election cycle?
Well, unfortunately, I think it lowers the bar for what's acceptable behavior. It would not have been acceptable behavior before 2020 for the loser to fail to acknowledge the winner of the election, or for the outgoing administration to welcome in the incoming administration for the good of the country, to try to have staff meeting one another, to share resources, to bring the incoming group into intelligence briefings, all of those kinds of issues. And for an inauguration day to be a celebration rather than a battle, and the counting of the electoral votes as part of that. So I continue to be concerned that it's set new standards for what we ought to expect. And I think it's really important that we dismiss those and say this is not an acceptable way for a proud democracy like ours to operate. And we need to return to an older model. Sometimes your party is going to win and sometimes they're going to lose. You've got to accept the rules and take your lumps and move on and try to do better next time. That's how it works.
Yeah, wow. Dr. Burden, we really appreciate you being on the show today. And I think one thing that's so fascinating is every time we have you, it's not only are you a wonderful source of information and wisdom, but on top of that, you then open a can of worms. Like we can have 5 different spin-off shows just on a lot of the things we've talked about today. But we really appreciate that. And unfortunately, the time has flown by, sort of like Dave's toupee when he's driving his convertible. But we are so grateful for you, for the time you've taken and sharing the information with us. Apologies to our regular guest, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, for running out of time again, but I'm sure we'll see him next week. So thanks so much, Dr. Burden, and thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Eric. And again, it's really a pleasure co-hosting the show with you. And thanks for bringing up my convertible. You know, with the weather changing and turning much nicer, I can hardly wait to get out there. And we've talked about this often, but I love the feel of wind through my hair. So I can hardly wait to get that roof down and head out down the highway one of these days. But yeah, thank you again, Dr. Burden, for being with us. You really plant a lot of seeds. You're very thought-provoking, and certainly I'm thinking about a lot of stuff here today, and I know our viewers are as well. So thank you, and to our viewers, we look forward to having you join us next week for another fantastic episode of Two Bald Guys.